I am Tim Shirley, the senior minister of the SouthShore United Church of Christ. This is a sermon for November 8th, Misfit Battle. All of us have heard at one time or another that powerful Negro spiritual, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Fit being a derivative of fought, by the way. Surely written to address African Americans' desire to be freed from the bonds of slavery. The line and the walls came tumbling down, carried significant meaning for those living the slings and arrows of a burdensome indentured life. All of us can understand the metaphorical imagery produced by those long-suffering slaves, all longing for liberation and a new life, getting their piece of the pie known as the American dream, something that white folks had long taken for granted. Their deepest desire was the removal of all the shackles, literally and figuratively excised, allowing for the sweet taste of freedom. The irony of the song, however, is that it praises Joshua as the hero in the narrative, as does the Bible, belying a dark side, something sinister brewing in the text. I bring all this to our attention today because, as I alluded to earlier, we are in the midst of some most troublesome readings from the Hebrew Bible in these epic adventure stories of Joshua and his merry band of militants. All of us know full well the story of the Battle of Jericho, but there are numerous other stories celebrating the conquest of peoples. Later in Joshua, the biblical writer even claims that God made the sun to stand still so that Joshua and his men, called them a militia, could slaughter even more of their enemies, further advancing their cause, making way for the new arrivals, the new and improved inhabitants, the chosen ones, purifying a land of promise flowing with milk and honey. The Israelites believed, had convinced themselves that this plot of sacred ground was bequeathed as their divine right, an entitlement theirs for the taking, seizing. Growing up, I remember hearing the epic heroic tales of the larger-than-life biblical characters as the Bible was brought to life in the wonderful adventure stories, all their content glorifying the heroes and heroines, amplified by the glow of a dim-lit room, as nightfall beckoned, while my mother would tenderly read. As children, of course, we did not question any of it, trusting that the good guys always win and the bad guys do not. Always getting what they deserved. The slaughter of the innocents never appeared on our virginally minded consciousness. All was well with our world, a safe and secure place protected by God's care. Now I lay me down to sleep. All was well. All was well until it wasn't. I'm not sure when the proverbial worm turned and I began to question the content in many of these stories, wondering why a God of love chose to play favorites, blessing some while cursing others, sparing some while obliterating the hell out of others. I knew that something was just not quite right, but I did not have the wherewithal to figure out what that fly in the ointment was. Just what was the source of my discomfort? That missing piece of the puzzle, the mysterious thing that seemed out of place, a bit off-putting, indeed more than a mite confusing and confounding. What was so evil about Goliath that he needed to have a hit job taken out on him? Perhaps this Philistine, evidently a very tall freak of nature to be sure, appearing larger than life in the biblical narrative. Maybe he had a wife and children, family, and believed that he was doing his duty, protecting his interests, his territory, even as did his adversaries. I don't know. Did God not love Philistines? Did God hate them? After all, God created them. What was it about so many villains in the biblical narrative who were villainized and then victimized, dispatched as if their lives did not matter? All lives matter. Why was it that when Joshua and his people were poised to enter the promised land, that God is supposedly the man behind the curtain, pulling the strings and demanding that this people, this select people, prepare for battle with the express purpose of annihilating the local inhabitants, who evidently were only warming the seat of this rich land, just taking up space, awaiting the true heirs? Why would God go on a search and destroy mission of a vast diversity of humanity? Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and lo and behold, last but not least, the Jebusites. Surely these people were created imago Dei, in the very image of God, just like the Israelites. For me, these kinds of troubling texts have always caused a conundrum, creating a crisis of faithful fidelity to what was once perceived as sacred story. Disturbingly conflicting narratives daring to reduce God to a respecter of certain persons, but not to others, making the Holy One seem small, a God who plays favorites. It is so easy to see how many biblical texts have been quoted out of context, weaponized in order to advance a prescribed agenda. These texts make up such a significant portion of the Hebrew Bible. They cannot be avoided. They cannot be ignored. Questions must be raised. We must deal with them. We must confront them. We must struggle and wrestle with them. Today, my friends, is one such day, knowing the limitations of time and space in a sermon setting. One of the things we learn when we peel back the layers of these rough-edged stories, these raw narratives, looking for the kernel of truth often hidden within them, we must always remember that to the victors belong both the spoils and, surely more importantly, the story. One is temporal, the other a lasting legacy. Yes, shamelessly, the winners always get to write the version that gets preserved in perpetuity. The other side, the losing side, is seldom heard, with most folks not caring what losers have to say anyway. Yes, the victors tell the story, as one-sided as that story always is. These narratives were and are an example of ancient propaganda, designed to promote a specific agenda and worldview. Therein is a major component in composing the DNA of these heroic biblical adventures. The second thing we have to remember is that these legendary tales, deeply steeped in mythological material, appear under the unacknowledged literary genre of narrative or salvation history. As John Shelby Spong would encourage us to consider, think the Iliad and the Odyssey from Greek mythology. These writings designed to attempt to explain the origins of a people, from whence they came, how they evolved and became who they were as a society, how they got to where they did. Using contemporary imagery, I like to use a couple of well-known fictional novels. How's that for some reinforced redundancy? Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code and Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. Each of these books uses factual material, historical material, to weave a fictional account. The focus is on the plot, not on the facts of the case. The writers taking great liberties to create a compelling storyline. And so it is with the biblical narrative. Very similar kinds of literature. But what about the violence? What about the people who really were slaughtered with the expressed goal of their ultimate annihilation? Dare we suggest extermination? A word that would come to haunt humanity centuries later at the apex of anti-Semitism. The Holocaust being the worst human atrocity in human history. Some wicked-minded fools have had the audacity to suggest that these kind of events were payback, that history repeated itself, that what went around came around. Evil is never justifiable in any form, ever. Evidently, no, obviously, these ancient atrocities, even if embellished or exaggerated in the Bible, really took place. These events really happened. Men, women, and children, and sometimes all the livestock, were summarily dispatched because of a belief, what was thought to be a larger and better purpose. And all because of the belief that God sanctioned it, that God approved and ordered it. Here lies the most problematic aspect of these highly controversial but strangely beloved stories. Here it is in a nutshell. In order to appease the mind and justify this horrific behavior, it assuages the soul and calms the spirit, if it can be believed. If the faithful can convince themselves that God favored the action, if we can buy into the narrative that these acts were divinely ordered, ordained from God, and that this was the proverbial God's will, a dangerous, loaded, and often manipulative phrase that has been used to justify all manner of human intention, invention, and indiscretion. It was only natural, as these biblical chroniclers looked back on the episodes and escapades of a people who were doing the best they knew. Let's own that. This being the cultural milieu of the day, that these writers created a spin as they interpreted these events in a way that suited their immediate and future needs by justifying every egregious act. The rearview mirror of history bringing an ironically satisfactory resolution, falsely revealing that God was in the works, that God was in the middle of it, that God was the cause and effect, falsely revealing that God was in the works, working out the salvation and survival of this escaping and once homeless, wilderness exiled people. Divide and conquer was most frequently the modus operandi of ancient peoples. Warring bands hoping to seize prized booty. The conquest of others, a sign of human resourcefulness and power, proving their God's bias and favor, blessing and superiority. Survival was always the ultimate goal, a necessary part of the fabric of their reality. It certainly does not justify or excuse the behavior, but it goes a long way toward explaining, at least making some sense of what was often pure, abject butchery. Frankly, there are two problems occurring simultaneously when we read challenging, confrontational, and controversial texts such as the ones before us today. The first is that there is always a human-made, human-initiated contest, a war of wills between deities, a competition designed to prove that my God, Big C, is bigger, better, and stronger than your God, little c. A lot was at stake, a lot riding on the outcome of these divine conflagrations. The local deity was always forced to flex some muscle to prove not only existence, but superiority, to show a certain level of divine virility, as if God possessed testosterone, as was often the case in the case of male deities. In Latino circles, this phenomenon is sometimes described as machismo, because after all, it was assumed that Yahweh, the Israelite God, so named, was indeed male in his anthropomorphic and theistic imagery. Unfortunately, the feminine divine represented in many of the foreign deities was often minimized to the point of almost being obliterated, often at the mercy of those seeking to wipe them from the map. One most notable battle was the showdown at Mount Carmel, pitting the prophets of Baal against the God of the prophet Elijah. We all know how that epic battle turned out. No surprise, no spoiler alert here. You knew who would win at the outset of the story. The second issue driving this competitive and combative mentality was the rampant territorialism that dominated local inhabitants. Security of ownership never beyond question, always in doubt. Possession was only as assured, as secure as one's military capability, because after all, the threat of loss and oppression was always just a loss away. Might always made right among deeply entrenched tribal, clannish people. The preservation and empowerment of tribe and clan, always priority one. Circling the wagons, a basic way of life. All these things combined serve to undergird an understanding of the nature of God in terms of divine dominance and tribal loyalty. It is a recipe for disaster. We can no longer simply dismiss these texts as irrelevant, choosing to ignore or avoid them. We cannot with any integrity simply willy-nilly shrug our shoulders and go, that's just the way it was back then. These ideas are based in a traditional and pervasive 19th century evangelistic and revivalist theological premise that God is interactive to a large degree. Many still hold to these ideals. Some even accept the archaic idea that back in biblical times, the universe worked under a different paradigm, the rubrics of what is called a different dispensation, that God was once involved with the world in a way no longer permissible today. It is nonsense. That dog won't hunt, that pig won't fly. What a wacko stretch of the most vivid imagination. There, but by the grace of God, go I. The church and the churches must find ways to intelligently wrestle with these horrific images and provide a cogent explanation for them, examining the context and culture that created these pre-scientific and exclusively nationalistic theocratic predispositions. We must ask and confront questions such as, does God kill babies? That was the not so subtle assumption made by the writer of the first Passover in the book of Exodus. I am never surprised, much less shocked at the response, the reaction really, conveyed by the writer of Psalm 137, wishing the worst on the babies of Babylon, the people who had taken the Israelites captive in 587 BCE. As we read, we feel their pain. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion, forced to sing songs of their homeland to their tormenting captors. The amusement, no doubt, in such tunes. But it is the end of the narrative that is so unsettling. O daughter of Babylon, you devastator, happy shall he be who requites you with what you have done to us. Happy shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. When will we learn? When will we learn that violence is never the answer, never a solution, that violence only begets violence? What goes around inevitably comes around every time, all the time. Intellectually curious, critically thinking individuals demand and deserve that we be ready and willing to engage and question, that we honestly struggle, sincerely wrestle with these difficult, terror-inducing texts in order to learn more about our origins, not only of our faith traditions, but of the way humanity evolved in its understanding of reality, including the vast universe and the mystery of the transcendent God who created it, inspiring awe and wonder, particularly focusing on this planet Earth we call home, an amazingly perfect biosphere in every way imaginable. In the name of the one who creates, redeems, and sustains, and reminds us daily that the God frequently revealed in the hard text of the Hebrew Bible is not the gracious and loving God revealed in the person of Jesus. And thank God for that. Amen and amen.